We are thankful to be together this evening to honor the God of heaven and worship Him in ways that we trust please Him and do the things that draw us closer to Him. We thank you for being with us this evening, especially if you're one of our visitors. I'm always happy to meet those who are interested in spiritual things. When Beethoven died, the cause of death at the time was not known. He had been reportedly plagued with a variety of unpleasant symptoms for some time. He was chronically irritable, he was depressed, and he suffered from abdominal pain. About 200 years after his death, chemical analysis of hair that had been clipped from his head the day after he died revealed that the culprit was lead poisoning. Lead poisoning. The end did not come quickly. The lead killed him slowly and quietly, as poison often does, one little bit of poison at a time. And that's exactly how bitterness works in our lives. It is a poison that works slowly and takes us down inexorably. It is a problem in, frankly, a lot of marriages at one point or another. It's a problem in a lot of relationships, period, at one point or another. I'm going to approach talking about bitterness tonight relative to marriage because I think for some reason, well, maybe I know the reason, that is where it rears its ugly head the most often in the lives of Christians. You have two people who love each other enormously to begin with, assuredly, and are attempting to love each other over a long period of years when they're facing challenges and difficulties and disagreements and sometimes hurting one another in ways that they didn't mean to, and sometimes they did mean to, and all of that just causes a lot of friction and scarring, and all of that can lead to bitterness, and it does in many marriages. I have, in my life, seen it. I have counseled couples who were in the throes of bitterness destroying their marriage. I have seen it elsewhere. I talked to a relative who lives out of state here this last week, and she was describing to me the trouble that bitterness caused in her marriage early on. Thankfully, it was overcome, and she and her husband were able to help a lot of other couples dealing with that and other problems. But that's the nature of it. So, bitterness can destroy a relationship and certainly a marriage. One little bit of poison at a time. It's like the lead poisoning. It accumulates in the soul slowly, but surely it poisons the one who carries it and often spreads to others that they are in relationships with. And certainly it can destroy what God intended for marriage. We want marriages to be marvelous. They need to be marvelous in order for there to be strong families, strong churches also rely on strong marriages, strong children who grow up believing in Jesus and loving the Lord and are useful people in society and in the kingdom of Christ. All of that is dependent to some degree at least, and some to a large degree, on good marriages, on marvelous marriages. And we want them to be marvelous instead of miserable. So I want to talk a little bit about what are some of the causes of bitterness? Where does that come from? How does it develop? And then we're going to look at some of the consequences of it and the need and the way to rid ourselves of it. So all of that in one brief lesson. Obviously, I'll not say everything that needs to be said about this topic. But still, let's think about some of the causes of bitterness. And the obvious cause of bitterness is internalizing resentment. In fact, that could be almost a definition of what bitterness is. In Luke chapter 15, we have the well-known story of the prodigal son and his older brother, who becomes as infamous as the prodigal son himself by the end of the story. So you remember the prodigal son comes home, he's received by his father with love, they throw a celebration, everything is wonderful, except that when the older brother sees what's going on, hears the celebration going on, he will have no part in it. He absolutely is not going to accept his little wayward brother home with open arms and he doesn't like it that his father has done it. And so they have this, what I would think would have been a pretty tense conversation. The father showing a lot of love for both sons, the older brother showing anything but love. And in Luke chapter 15, I'll just read a couple of the verses here. Talking about the older brother, it says, he was angry in verse 28. He would not go in. His father came out and pleaded with him. So he answered him and said to his father, lo, these many years I have been serving you. Let's just stop there. These many years I have been serving you. And the way he says it and the context in which he says it, I think we can deduce that he had not been serving his father happily. He had not been serving his father perhaps out of love. Maybe that's reading too much into it, but maybe not. These many years I've been serving you. I've never transgressed your commandment at any time, yet you never gave me a young goat that I might make merry with my friends. And as soon as this son of yours came, who has devoured your livelihood with harlots, you killed the fatted calf for him. Anybody sense a little bitterness there? Just a little bit, right? He is overwhelmingly bitter. He is bitter that his father has not done for him, the faithful son, the good son, what he was so ready and willing to do for the wayward son. He is bitter that his father, apparently in his mind, did not appreciate all that he'd done for his father in comparison to what his brother had done to embarrass and harm his father. In every marriage, husbands and wives hurt each other. That's in every marriage, I do believe. It's usually not intentional, but it is inevitable. Sometimes a spouse will continue to repeat a behavior that hurts the other, even after having been confronted with the fact that that behavior hurts. And so then bitterness gets a foothold when you feed the hurt instead of granting forgiveness, when you continue to hold it in your mind and heart. Someone has said that people can treat their marriage like they're making a stew. You take everything that happens and you stew about it. You take a big pot, big black pot, and you dissect every offense and you throw it into this big cast iron pot that you have for a heart, and you bring it to a boil and you just let it simmer and simmer and simmer, and then one day something happens and you turn cold and it all hardens. And that's bitterness. It's a pretty good description of what bitterness is. You can't hold on to a grudge and it be healthy for you. Whatever your reason is for holding on to it, whatever rationalization you've made that I am okay because I was hurt and so I can hold on to this, it's going to hurt you. Someone has said that no matter how long you nurse a grudge, it won't get better. It won't get better. So you internalize the resentment, you hold on to it, and that is really the definition of what bitterness is and becomes. And it's caused a lot of times, less acknowledged, by being sinned against. Now, that's not to say somebody sins against me and therefore I have got to be bitter. I'm not saying that at all, but I am saying that being sinned against is the impetus for a lot of bitterness. It is, if we would trace it as if it were a disease, it's the etiology of it. A husband or wife's sinful behavior in that relationship can create bitterness. A woman who is manipulative and deceitful and does all of that to have her own way or to control her husband is going to create bitterness in her husband. Ecclesiastes chapter 7 and verse 26, the wise man there says, I find more bitter than death the woman whose heart is snares and nets. creates bitterness. In Proverbs 12 and verse 4, an excellent wife is the crown of a husband, but she who causes shame is like rottenness to his bones. The word shame there does not mean embarrassment, but as it's used often in the poetry literature of the Old Testament, like Psalms and Proverbs, the word shame relates to the shame of sin, not to superficial embarrassment. So here when he says that she who causes shame is like rottenness to his bones, the sin that she causes the husband just to rot inside. On the other hand, a husband can equally, through his sinfulness, create bitterness in the heart of his wife. Lots of examples of that in human history, lots of examples of that in modern times among our friends and acquaintances, and probably at times in our own households, where the husband, the man, the father has taken liberties with his authority, has abused that, has been unkind, has been inconsiderate, has been selfish, has said things in anger that should not be said or done. But that can create bitterness. Nabal, back in the Old Testament, is an example. Nabal was not a pleasant man. You might remember he was the husband of Abigail at first, and David and his men had treated Nabal's men kindly, and Nabal didn't want to repay the kindness. He was cruel and dismissive when David sent men to him. And we're told about Nabal in 1 Samuel, in chapter 25, verse 3. The name of the man was Nabal, and the name of his wife was Abigail, and she was a woman of good understanding and beautiful appearance. But the man was harsh and evil in his doings. He was of the house of Caleb. So here you have a harsh man. He's a man who's evil in his doings, and certainly Abigail had experienced probably the brunt of that in her life. And we don't have to guess at that, because later on when David comes to attack Nabal for what Nabal had done in turning his men away, Abigail says to David in 1 Samuel 25, verse 25, "Please let not my Lord regard this scoundrel Nabal, for as his name is, so is he. Nabal is his name, and folly is with him." That's his wife, Nabal's wife, talking about her husband. He's a scoundrel. He's a man of folly. The word Nabal means folly or fool in the Hebrew language, and so she recognizes that's his character, and she sees that. Abigail is plainly a fine woman. Later on, of course, David marries her after Nabal dies. But you see in this text, she's a bit bitter. You can look at some other aspects of how this story unfolds, and you can kind of see that. When she does some nice things here for David, she goes home and Nabal sulls up and wouldn't talk to her. There's bitterness all over that relationship. These are just a couple of examples, a couple of simple points, looking at some scriptures that verify the problem of internalizing resentment and the problem of being sinned against are two things that create a lot of bitterness. Well, the consequences of bitterness are hard to list. There are so many of them. And they're so negative. They're so harmful to, as I said, any relationship, but especially a marriage. And I hope husbands and wives, I hope you're listening carefully. No matter how long you've been married. All of us need this. A bitter person often, because of his bitterness, is going to behave in unseemly and sinful ways. And these are ways that had not maybe been observed in his personality or in his behavior before the bitterness occurred. He'll say certain things or she'll do certain things that are coming out of the bitterness, and were the bitterness not there, they would not be saying or doing these things. And the root cause of a lot of other sins that are committed against one another in a marriage is bitterness. A bitter person is identified in a lot of ways, maybe by a sad and troubled countenance. Maybe they're sarcastic, maybe they're critical, maybe they're reluctant to trust you. There was a marriage counselor that wrote a book some years ago, listed 18 signs to look for in your spouse that indicates that they're bitter. Let me share some of them with you. Frequent arguments, the inability to resolve conflicts, outbursts of anger, raising of the voice, throwing things, hitting, withdrawal, giving someone, the other person, the silent treatment or the cold shoulder, diminished affection or sexual activity, sarcasm, mocking, ridiculing, mean-spirited joking, acts of vengeance, getting even or trying to hurt somebody back, condescending communication, speaking down to another person as if they're inferior or a child, criticism, condemning and judgmental attitude, suspicion and distrust, hypersensitivity, intolerance, overlooking little offenses that were once not even noticed, but now they're not tolerated, impatience, lack of social interaction with other people, other couples, loss of companionship, communication becomes superficial, lack of respect, dishonoring the husband or the wife in the presence of others, lack of kindness, lack of sympathy, and if you have children, angry children who are experiencing all of this day by day. Those are some of the unseemly and sinful personality changes that come out of bitterness. And it's something that poisons the one who's infected by it, for sure. So that person cannot please the Lord in the role that he or she is assigned in the home. This is true, again, for both husbands and wives. Someone who's just overwhelmed with bitterness is not going to be a good husband, if they're the man, or a good wife. They cannot be, as long as bitterness is controlling their lives. They can act like it once in a while, but they're not going to be able to fulfill the role that God gave them. Job in Job 36 and verse 13. Elihu speaking there, the great, insightful younger man who presents himself toward the end of the book of Job. He says that the hypocrites in heart store up wrath. They do not cry for help when he binds them. The NIV there says, instead of storing up wrath, harbor resentment. And as we said, that's kind of what bitterness is. Holding grudges, harboring resentment, letting that build up. Resentment is like taking poison and taking it and waiting for the other person to die. And it's not going to work that way. So, really negative consequences of bitterness. And as we've intimated already, it really prevents the husband and the wife from fulfilling their roles, but particularly the husband in this case, and this is something the Bible addresses explicitly. One of the most challenging tasks faced by the head of the family is the responsibility to give due consideration to the needs of those whom he's the head of. And you just really can't do that when you're bitter towards them. The fact is that the true head, the head that God has designed the man to be in the home, is one that nourishes and cherishes his wife like his own body. Ephesians chapter 5, verses 28 and 29. The husband who is doing what he should be doing is going to be as concerned about the needs and welfare of his wife as he is about his own. He cherishes her and takes care of her like he does his own body. He must dwell with her according to understanding, giving honor to the wife as to the weaker vessel. Honoring her. That's his job as a husband. That's part of his role. Part of his role is understanding her, Somebody who's overwhelmed with bitterness isn't even going to try to understand the other person most of the time. But a husband that's a true head, that's a Christ-like head, who loves his wife like Christ loves the church, he's going to understand the special physical and emotional needs of his wife, which are different from his by far. In practical terms, this may mean that the husband is going to consider her needs for affection and reassurance throughout the day, for communication, for being willing to listen to her requests carefully, to tune out other things, work and TV and sports and other things, to give her the attention that she needs. Failing to understand the needs of wives is both the cause and the consequence of bitterness. Failing to understand the needs of your wife is both the cause and the consequence of bitterness. The Bible, as I said, addresses this problem with husbands very directly. When Paul writes in Colossians chapter 3 and verse 19, "Husbands, love your wives and do not be bitter toward them." The root of the problem, as seen in that verse, is a failure to love and honor the wife. Honor means to value or highly esteem. Bitterness doesn't enable us or allow us to do that. When a husband ignores his wife's words, her feelings, her thoughts, her opinions, he's not valuing her. He's dishonoring her, contrary to God's will. Further, in the case of both the husband and the wife, bitterness prevents forgiveness. You're not going to forgive somebody you're bitter against. You can't let go of your list of offenses long enough to do that. You've held that grudge, and we're going to talk about in a minute the need for forgiveness and how to accomplish it. Bitterness keeps the offender from changing their ways. That is to say, you're the one that's bitter. Somebody has offended you, but you're so mean to them and closed off from them that you're motivating them to be bitter as well. You are, as we said, sin results in bitterness. You are sinning against the other person now by your bitterness, and that's going to cause the reaction of bitterness in them. It's a vicious circle, isn't it? It feeds on itself. Bitterness starts off as a small offense that the bitter person doesn't address with their spouse. Each new offense feeds the bitterness, takes up a lot more room in the person's mind and heart. And that's cultivated and allowed to simmer, as we've already said, in your heart. And you don't air your grievances to your spouse. Your spouse cannot apologize or change something that they don't know they're doing wrong. And if you do finally air your grievance, it's often with such a contentious spirit that it encourages strife instead of reconciliation. The other person is never going to respond to the bitter, angry words when you finally just blow up with all of your resentment. Bitterness spreads. It, as I said, is infectious. It's contagious. It moves from one heart to another very easily. We're warned about that in Scripture as well. Hebrews 12 and verse 15, we're told to look carefully lest anyone fall short of the grace of God, lest any root of bitterness springing up cause trouble, and by this many become defiled. See how the description there? It springs up. Many people then become defiled by this root of bitterness, as it's called here. Once bitterness has taken hold, it tends to contaminate the hearts of others. Everything that we see and feel, everything the other person does, even if it's something good, has a black cloud to it. The bitterness spreads like a crack in a windshield. It just starts out like this, and then it just goes everywhere and weakens everything. So that's a pretty ugly picture, isn't it? Sorry about that. But it's reality. And as I said, it's something that every human being needs to deal with in their relationships. And that many marriages over the years, most all of them that I know of, are going to face at one time or another. How do we deal with that? How do we correct this scourge in our marriage, this thing that's tearing marriages apart and making them miserable and making other relationships miserable as well? What can we do about it? I am thankful, as I'm with you here tonight, that Jesus is not bitter toward all of the people who put him on a cross. That Jesus is not bitter for all of the awful things that were done to him, none of which he deserved. I am thankful for the example and the grace of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, who shows us how to overcome bitterness and enables us to do that, giving us a path to forgiveness and holiness. Bitterness must be corrected. We cannot let it live within us. And wherever you are tonight in your life, if there's bitterness in your heart toward anyone, toward anything, I just want you to know you have got to get that out. It will ruin everything. In Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 31, let all bitterness, wrath, anger, clamor, evil speaking be put away from you with all malice. Notice the first thing in that list of bad things is bitterness. Let all bitterness be put away. Especially in relationships in the home, as we've already seen, Colossians 3:19, Paul telling husbands, do not be bitter against your wives. And the way that has to occur is you have to admit it. Look, no sin, you will never be able to overcome any sin in your life if you don't acknowledge it. The first step to repenting, to getting this thing out of your life, is to acknowledge that you've got it. You ever been in a shouting match or seen a shouting match between two people, and finally they wind up shouting, I'm not angry, well, I'm not angry either, right? I'm not bitter. Really? We need to admit it to ourselves. That's the hardest thing to do. To admit that my real problem is I'm bitter. At the core, that's what it is. Lots of things could have caused the bitterness. Some legitimate, some not. But it's a sin. We have to deal with that. It's a sin. We have to treat it like any other sin. One of the strongest holds that bitterness has on us is its secrecy, because we think nobody knows. And we think that we can keep it hidden. Once you voice your concerns, first of all to yourself, and then to the person that you're bitter against, it can be dealt with. This is the way to deal with any sin. Confess your trespasses to one another and pray for one another that you may be healed. James chapter 5 and verse 16. Confess your bitterness. Forgive and seek forgiveness. Whatever the grudge was, whatever has brought you to this point, work to find a way to forgive. Listen to Paul again in Colossians chapter 3 now in verse 12. Therefore, as the elect of God, holy and beloved, put on tender mercies, kindness, humility, meekness, long-suffering, bearing with one another, and forgiving one another. If anyone has a complaint against another, even as Christ forgave you, so you also must do. This is a must here. We've talked just recently in a sermon about the need and the way of forgiveness. I'm not going to re-preach all of that, but that's what has to happen here. It's been said that a happy marriage is the union of two good forgivers. Maybe one of the most important components in any marriage. On the other hand, nearly every miserable marriage and rotten relationship is characterized by holding grudges, by keeping account of wrongs, and by wallowing in bitterness. You might remember the behavior of love in 1 Corinthians chapter 13. It keeps no account of evil. It doesn't keep score. It doesn't hold a grudge. We must forgive. We must find a way to forgive. Even as Christ, at the very sacrifice of his own life, found a way to forgive us. Here's the example of grace. Here's the example of the extent that one must go to rid oneself of the problem of bitterness and to find a way to forgive others. Seek peace with your spouse and have the grace to forgive. Most couples that I've had interactions with over the years are having marital problems. All of them have had bitterness as a component of the problems, I can tell you that, every last one. And the vast majority of them each individual had problems seeing their own need for forgiveness. We need to see that. When we preach on forgiveness, I've said these things more than once from this pulpit. I'm going to repeat them just quickly for us before we close. The nature of forgiveness. Real forgiveness can't occur if we're walking around with a false concept of what it is. So I think clarity on this point is really crucial. Forgiveness is not just forgetting or excusing. It may involve those things, but that's not it. You just say, well, that's okay, never mind, forget about it. So we can't just sweep it under the carpet. We can't just bury it and pretend like it didn't happen. We need to know that somebody's going to try to change. I'm going to be happy to forgive that. And we're going to deal with it in a positive way going forward. We're just not going to ignore that it happened. Pretend like it didn't. Forgiveness is more than just tolerance or acceptance or excusing something. You know, we excuse something because it was an accident. Because somebody didn't mean it. Because it was inadvertent. We forgive people of things, though, that are not okay, that are intentional. Forgiveness is not tolerance. Tolerance is something we need. It's enduring something that's hard or painful or irritating. We're to have that. Long-suffering, bearing with one another in love, that's tolerance. And that's related to forgiveness, but it's not forgiveness. Forgiveness, as I said, is not acceptance. You accept things about a person that you don't particularly like. That's needed in a good relationship. They may have opinions about certain things that you don't particularly like. They may root for the wrong football team, But there's things you got to accept, and that's okay. That's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about matters of judgment or personal preferences about things that are neither right nor wrong. Forgiveness assumes that somebody has done wrong and somebody has been wronged or mistreated. Jesus said, "Take heed to yourselves. If your brother sins against you, rebuke him, and if he repents, forgive him." That's our obligation. Forgiveness is needed when sin has been committed. As we wind down this evening, and I appreciate your good attention tonight, in every relationship I found maybe the key to all of it, interpersonal relationships and especially in marriages, that when it comes down to it, the only person you can actually change, the only person you have control of is you. And you need to make sure that you are doing what's right in every way. That's a level of self-examination and introspection. It's uncomfortable. We have to jettison our pride. We have to let down our defenses and look at ourselves through the eyes of the Lord. This evening, in your life, I want you to think about whether or not there is bitterness and resolve to let bitterness go and embrace the good things in life and your relationship that God has intended, characterized typically by honest communication and love. You can choose to make your life, your relationships better and not bitter. And you can do things to bring that about, and the Lord will help you. God, friends and brethren, He's so good to us. We are at times really bad to wander as sheep, aren't we? And go astray. And the shepherd loves us and wants us to come back. And if you've wandered away tonight, He wants you to come back. And if there's bitterness in your heart or other sins in your heart that need correcting and need resolving, if you need to confess something to the group tonight and have us pray with you and help you overcome it, we'll be happy to do that. If it's something that's interpersonal in your relationship, resolve to take care of that. God loves you. Jesus died for you. He wants us to live wonderful lives and not let Satan have a foothold. Work hard on not letting Satan have a foothold. If you're in need of the Lord tonight, we'd ask you to come while we stand and while we sing.